Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America, Episode 25, The Last of the Stuarts. Last time, we wrapped up the story of the Glorious Revolution as it played out in the colonies. Today, we're going to look at the further political history of England, up through the death of Queen Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, some 25 years later. This isn't an English history podcast, but I thought it would be a good idea to give this period its own episode, since events in the colonies are more intertwined with England's foreign policy than ever before, and you can't understand their history without understanding a bit of the bigger picture. My main source for this episode is the book A Land of Liberty, England 1689 to 1727 by Julian Hoppet. So, it's time to begin the reigns of William and Mary. Well, really mostly William, since his wife only wielded power when he was out of the country. And Mary died in 1694, just 5 years after taking the throne, leaving William to continue on as sole monarch for another 8 years. What sort of realm had they conquered? Well, in 1689, England had a population of about 5 million, not too much higher than the population 50 years ago of 4.5 million. For comparison, there were 22 million people in France. English life expectancy was in the mid-30s, which was actually high by European standards. 20% of English subjects now lived in urban areas, up from 10% at the start of the century. This was high relative to the rest of Europe. Over half of those city dwellers were in London itself, which had a population of 500,000. England may have still been a mostly rural country, but it was no longer a medieval one. Markets were becoming more and more important as old traditions went into decline. The economy was now primarily based around private property, not ties of feudal obligation. And villages were reorganizing themselves to match the times. Much of the land which had been previously held commonly was now enclosed. That is, use of the land was now restricted to its owner, instead of being open to the community. Agricultural productivity was rising, and the nation was increasingly linked together by a dense network of trade. In 1694, the Bank of England, one of the world's first central banks, was founded, which greatly increased the fiscal capacity of the state and further modernized the economy as a whole. And internationally, the English were surpassing the Dutch to become the world's great trading nation. According to Hoppet, quote, improvements were being made to the quality of connections between England and her trading world. Developments in marine insurance, centering on Lloyd's Coffee House, ship design and construction, and navigational aids all helped. Journey times were also tending to decrease, and a greater volume of traffic meant news could be communicated more immediately. Transatlantic packet boat services were established for military reasons in 1702 and 1710, and by 1730 it took London news 90 days to appear in the Boston newsletter, compared to over 160 at the start of the century. End quote. So, all in all, William and Mary had conquered a nation on the rise. England wasn't industrialized yet, but it was modernizing. But that didn't mean that they could just sit back and let the country run itself. There was still plenty of political problems left to solve in the wake of the Revolution. But thankfully for England, William was an able leader, smart and hard-working, though not especially charismatic, and always a foreigner. His main goal in all this was to get money and men to fight France. He had to do a lot of other things to get that money, appease Parliament, suppress a rebellion in Ireland, but that was all secondary, a means to an end. As far as anyone at the time was concerned, this was the biggest change. England, the parliamentary naval power, was now at war with France, the autocratic land power and the leading nation in Europe. We're entering a period some historians have called the Second Hundred Years' War, a sustained, off-and-on conflict between France and England, which in this case will last from 1689 to the fall of Napoleon in 1815. Britain and France will be at war over half the time in this period, the two mightiest powers of Europe battling for supremacy, a struggle that will shape American history even after independence. This first war, known as the 9 Years' War or as King William's War in America, was basically a grand alliance between various European nations to check the ambitions of Louis XIV of France. France was at the height of its powers and looking to dominate its neighbors, who naturally decided to fight back. English sentiment had mostly been anti-French before the Glorious Revolution, but Charles II and James II had found it personally desirable to pursue a pro-French foreign policy instead. But now that William and Mary were on the throne, things could settle into a more natural pattern. Indeed, it was now very apparent that England and France were destined to become great rivals. As far as the colonies were concerned, England's war with France meant that they were going to war against the French colony of Quebec to the north and their Indian allies. Now, although France was first and foremost a land power, it had also acquired a colonial empire of its own. As of about 1700, France had possessions in India, South America, and the Caribbean, including Haiti, but these were mostly small outposts. At least in terms of geography, the largest French possession by far was in North America. This territory, known as New France, was vast. French explorers had traveled up the St. Lawrence River to the Great Lakes as well as up the Mississippi. They controlled, or at least claimed to control, all the land around both of these regions, in a big arc which reached from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Atlantic. In other words, New France surrounded the English colonies. If the English tried to move inland, sooner or later they would hit French territory, no matter where they were. Obviously, this greatly limited the possibility for future expansion. Now, realistically, this control was mostly hypothetical. The French made big claims, but New France was very thinly populated, at least by Europeans. There had never been a big colonization push, and so the population remained many times smaller than in the English colonies, despite its much larger size. And anyway, there wasn't yet a permanent presence along the Mississippi. You can claim the entire Mississippi watershed, but if you only have like 15 guys there, who cares? That fact alone was probably enough to give the English a decisive advantage in the long run. However, as we heard about in episode 23, the English colonies were plagued by persistent military incompetence. As a result, they suffered numerous humiliations, and the French remained in North America for decades to come. But we'll talk more about the wars in the colonies next time. There's no need to get into the details of the war in Europe either. The 9 Years' War was fought on an unprecedentedly large scale, with armies of up to 100,000 men. However, few of those soldiers were actually English. The English instead focused their efforts at sea. Gradually, the Allies wore France down without scoring any major victories until everyone was ready for peace. In 1697, the war finally came to a close. In Europe and in America, the results were inconclusive. Some territory changed hands, but none of the underlying issues were resolved. War would return to both continents within just a few years. But basically, the 9 Years' War was forgettable as far as 9-year-long wars go. There's a reason you've probably barely heard of it. In the long run, the development of the English political system was far more important, so that's what I'm going to spend most of this episode talking about. The most important thing the Glorious Revolution did was cement Parliament's ever-growing dominance. It was a mixed constitution, balanced between the King, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, but with the Commons perpetually gaining in power. There was no sudden switch, no one moment where the King became a figurehead, but it was happening. As part of this shift, the Privy Council, the King's top advisors, were becoming less important. It was too unwieldy for one group of men to handle all affairs of state, so the Privy Council had been divided into smaller committees like the Lords of Trade to handle specific issues. One of those committees was tasked with coordinating everything and handling the most important matters. Naturally, this smaller group soon became central to the whole government. This is the origin of the modern British cabinet system. Because Parliament was so powerful, it was important for the cabinet to have a working relationship with Parliament. So important, in fact, that Parliament could effectively control its membership, since the cabinet was useless without parliamentary approval. That's a very quick summary of a very momentous and complex change, so let me re-summarize just to make sure everything's clear. The Privy Council was eclipsed in importance by a smaller committee within the Privy Council. But this committee, or cabinet, was soon much more under the control of Parliament than of the King, and so the monarchy became hugely constrained in terms of which officials they could pick to run the government. That power too slowly passed into parliamentary hands. The position of Prime Minister wouldn't be created for a few more decades, but otherwise the English government was finally taking on a recognizably modern form. This development never happened in the colonies. They were on their own path now. But speaking of the colonies, although Parliament was gaining in power generally, the colonies were still mostly under the control of the King, and he still had primary jurisdiction over them. Parliament was involved in things like the Navigation Act, sure, but the colonies were the King's domains first and foremost. He, or proprietors chosen by him, called the shots. After the Glorious Revolution, Parliament did begin to take a more active role. After all, trade and government spending were under their authority, and both trade policy and spending on the colonies were of increasing importance. It wasn't like before, where you could let people settle America on their own dime, with little need for oversight. Now the colonies were valuable possessions which had to be defended. But Parliament was still slow to take over direct administration, preferring instead to stick to indirect oversight, so this shift didn't necessarily make a huge difference from the perspective of the colonists. After all, it was still Englishmen crafting English policy to suit English needs. It did mean that colonial policy was less feudal and less personalized, less tied to the interests of the royal family. Despite previous attempts to centralize administration with bodies like the Lords of Trade, there was still no one person or group in charge of everything. The Lords of Trade themselves were replaced in 1696 with a slightly different group known as the Board of Trade. It wasn't technically part of the Privy Council, but other than that it was basically the same thing, just with a less cool name. and within the cabinet, the Secretary of State for the Southern Department was in charge of the colonies, along with a bunch of other more important responsibilities. Plus, other agencies like the Treasury, the Navy, and the Customs Office all had their own agendas in America. Add to that the intermittent supervision of Parliament, and you can see why things were often an aimless mess. Considering the colony's importance, it was all pretty cobbled together and half-hearted. Still, given how things went when England took an active interest in the colonies, I'm sure the Americans were more than happy to be forgotten. Back to England. One of the most noteworthy developments of this period was the formation of permanent political factions which, over time, morphed into the first real modern parties in world history. The two main factions were the Whigs and the Tories, both of which slightly predated the Glorious Revolution. The Whigs were the faction which had opposed James II. They had tried to force Charles II to exclude him from the line of succession on account of his Catholicism, and after James became king, they still opposed him. At first they were seen as the enlightened, modern faction, opposed to the medieval pretensions of the Stuarts and supportive of parliamentary supremacy. The Tories, on the other hand, had formed to defend everything that the Whigs were attacking. Well, everything other than Catholicism, anyway. The Tories supported Anglicanism, obedience to the king, and a submissive parliament. The Tories had only been convinced to support William's invasion because it was so obvious that James was trying to boost Catholicism and destroy the Anglican settlement. Even then, the whole thing made them uneasy. They had basically sacrificed one of their big principles for the sake of another. Outside of the Whigs and Tories, there were some radicals, including the Jacobites, who wanted to restore James II to the throne. Jacobite sentiments were particularly strong in Catholic Ireland and parts of Scotland. Indeed, in 1690, James, backed by France, launched an unsuccessful attempt to retake England by first invading Ireland. But the Jacobite threat fizzled in the end, so it's mainly the Whigs and Tories that we need to worry about. King William at first tried to steer a middle course between the two, but this proved impossible, since each side was unwilling to cooperate with the other. He wound up favoring the Whigs, even though the Whigs were enemies of royal power, since their views were otherwise more closely matched to his, and since the Tories were too closely tied to the previous regime. However, as time went on, the Whigs got used to all of this power, and so they moderated their anti-monarchical views. The Tories, on the other hand, since they were now on the outside, found themselves increasingly skeptical of royal power. It would be impossible to speak of a single Whig ideology or a single Tory ideology. They were both nebulous and shifting coalitions finding their footing in a new political landscape. You could speak in general of Whig ideas or Tory ideas, but things get fuzzy if you look at the specifics or if you look at different points in time. They were two separate factions, but their interests and beliefs shifted over time, and sometimes they wound up swapping positions. You might think that with the Glorious Revolution secured, the Whigs and Tories would dissolve. After all, the disputes that had led to their creation were now a thing of the past, and historically that would have been enough to end the squabbling. However, neither the Whigs nor the Tories were going anywhere. In part, this was due to the passage of the Triennial Act in 1694. Under this bill, Parliament would meet once a year, and elections for a new Parliament would be held every 3 years. The goal was to limit the King's powers over Parliament by taking away his ability to call for new elections and to dismiss Parliaments at his leisure. But the real impact of the Triennial Act was to plunge England into a period known as the, quote, Rage of Party. Frequent elections meant that people were more engaged with politics than ever before, and both the Whigs and Tories were in fierce competition with each other. It was hard to get elected without belonging to a faction. Apparently some 80% of members of Parliament can clearly be identified as either Whigs or Tories. Even local officials were often associated with one faction or the other. Also, in 1695, Parliament had allowed the Licensing Act to expire. The Licensing Act had basically authorized censorship of the press. All printers had to get a license from the government in order to print, and they could be shut down if they got on the wrong side of the king. When the Licensing Act expired, there was a big boom in printing and pamphleteering. This made party politics even more intense than it already was. Day after day, Tories and Whigs went after each other in the press. Very modern. But despite all these new developments, voting rights remained quite limited. Things hadn't really changed much in the past 80 years. In 1701, there were about 190,000 men with the right to vote out of a population of 5.2 million. This was still high by the standards of the day, partly just because there were any elections at all, which was unusual, but those numbers weren't increasing. And there were plenty of other undemocratic elements beyond just these limited voting rights. First, both the monarch and the House of Lords still had major roles to play, and although the House of Commons was to some degree representative, it was still dominated by the well-to-do. Second, most elections still went uncontested. There was often only one person running, and so the voters in that district had no choice in the matter. According to Hoppet, quote, in the 15 general elections between 1689 and 1727, an average of just 37% of constituencies were contested at the polls, ranging from a low of 23% in 1689 to a high of 53% in 1722, end quote. And it was still the case that each constituency elected 2 seats to Parliament, so sometimes the Tories and Whigs would each agree to put forward a single candidate, sparing the need for a real vote. So even if you had the vote, you probably wouldn't actually get to vote in a given election. Third, when elections were disputed, things were decided by Parliament itself, which meant that the ruling party would invariably decide in favor of its own candidate. The Whigs would find in favor of the Whig and the Tories in favor of the Tory. So you couldn't count on fairness in election procedures even when there was an election. Fourth, the voting districts could be highly unequal in their populations. So-called rotten boroughs were so small that they could easily be controlled by wealthy men or powerful families. I mean, some of these districts are so small that literally less than 10 voters were living in them. On the other hand, burgeoning towns with thousands of people might have no representation at all. And voting requirements varied considerably between England, Scotland, and Wales, introducing further geographic bias. All these inequalities were holdovers from medieval times, basically. Parliament hadn't adjusted itself to modern conditions. Voting was still traditional rather than something that needed to be rationalized. No one was thinking in terms of one person, one vote, or anything like that. People were still debating whether authority flowed from the people or from God. They hadn't really progressed to thinking about how authority might flow from the people. And since voting wasn't seen as a universal right, there was no big push to change any of this. And in any case, the people as a whole didn't have the same sort of economic or cultural power as they would later, so I rather suspect that the current arrangement matched the actual distribution of power in society, since there was no broad middle class or anything. I should emphasize that things haven't gotten worse over the last century. Worse from the perspective of someone who's pro-democracy, I mean. They've stayed roughly the same, it's just that the first time I talked about it, I emphasized how democratic England was relative to its contemporaries, whereas now I'm emphasizing how undemocratic it was relative to some hypothetical ideal that almost no one at the time actually believed in. Same facts, different emotional punch. Just something to keep in mind. Anyway, while the electoral system of England was busy staying exactly the same, continental Europe was busy falling back into war with France. This new war, known as the War of the Spanish Succession, or as Queen Anne's War in America, was caused by, you guessed it, the Spanish Succession. When the King of Spain, the inbred and disabled Charles II, died childless, there was great concern over who would inherit his vast empire. One potential claimant was the grandson of Louis XIV. If he took the throne, then Spain would likely fall into line with France, increasing France's status as a great power even more. The other European powers saw this as unacceptable, and so they backed another claimant to the throne. No compromise could be reached, and war broke out in 1702. In England, King William began military preparations, but before he could finish, he fell off of his horse and broke his collarbone, which led to an infection that killed him within days. He was only 51. He had never really won the total support of his English subjects, though I think they generally respected him. He was not deeply mourned. Since he and Mary had never had children, the throne passed to Mary's sister, Anne. Thus England and the Netherlands no longer shared a ruler. Anne was less able than William, and she was often incapacitated by illness, sometimes barely able to walk, but with the help of her advisors, business carried on. Anne continued William's policies. Less than a month after his death, she declared war on France. The war lasted almost the entirety of Anne's reign, a full 13 years, only coming to an end in 1714, although English participation had wrapped up a bit before that. In the colonies, this meant a return to the same incompetence that defined the last war. I'll get into more details on that later. In Europe, the English had more success on the battlefield this time, but once again it became a war of attrition with an inconclusive ending. The French managed to put their candidate on the Spanish throne, but were frustrated in many of their other ambitions. Perhaps the most important result was that England had now become a major European power. Before, it had been a second-rate nation. Not inconsequential, but also more of a follower than a leader. Now it was the one financing the war against France and the one coordinating strategy. These two wars greatly expanded the power of the state. According to Hoppet, quote, in the 10 years before the Glorious Revolution, total government expenditure was usually about £1.7 million a year. During the 9 Years' War, this had risen to £4.9 million per annum, and in the War of the Spanish Succession to £7.8 million, with about 3/4 of expenditure in war years devoted to the military, End quote. Spending went up, taxes went up, borrowing went up, and the bureaucracy grew accordingly. War was driving the creation of a modern state. Domestically, there are a few important things to note during Queen Anne's reign, most especially the Act of Union, which finally unified the governments of England and Scotland. Let's take a step back. In the late 1200s, the English finished conquering Wales, and in the 1500s, Wales was fully incorporated into the rest of England, so Wales operated under English laws, Welsh representatives sat in Parliament at London, and so on. Ireland, on the other hand, had been slowly conquered by England over the course of centuries, but since it remained so culturally distinct, it continued to be ruled as a separate kingdom, with its own parliament modelled on that of England's. Scotland, on the other hand, had been an independent nation which only united with England in 1603 because the King of Scotland, James I, happened to be the heir to the throne of England after Elizabeth. But this union was only partial. England and Scotland shared a monarch, but not much else. They had separate parliaments, separate laws, separate varieties of Protestantism, and so on. This had benefits for Scotland, but it also had downsides. As a separate country, Scotland was cut off from many of the benefits of England's empire. For instance, the Navigation Act said that shipping to and from the colonies had to be carried out on English ships with English sailors, which obviously hurt the Scottish economy. But over the last century, the two nations, which had previously been fierce rivals, had grown closer and closer. England had a much larger population than Scotland, and so the Scots naturally fell into orbit around England and around London, though they didn't totally lose their national identity or anything. Certainly the English wanted a closer union with Scotland for reasons of national security. An independent Scotland could be used by some foreign power to invade England after all. Scottish opinion was more mixed, and there were even people who proposed dissolving the union altogether when Anne died. But in the end, negotiations for a closer union succeeded completely. England and Scotland were to become a single kingdom. Scotland was allowed to keep its own laws and its own national church, but the two parliaments were to be merged into one. Anne was no longer Queen of England, Queen of Scotland, and Queen of Ireland. Now she was the Queen of Great Britain and of Ireland. So from now on, the American colonies can't be referred to as English colonies anymore, they're British colonies. There was still discontent in Scotland, sometimes violent discontent, but in the end the Union held. And in fact, the Scottish people, despite their small size, would have an outsized presence in the British Empire and in British culture at large, thanks especially to prominent scholars like Adam Smith and David Hume. Beyond the Act of Union, the slow progress of political development continued. Unlike William, who favored the Whigs, Queen Anne favored moderate Tories, and they were generally dominant under her rule. But that didn't mean that the Tories had total control. Anne was still able to shape policy somewhat, thanks to the fact that the Whigs and Tories hadn't yet become proper political parties. In a modern parliamentary democracy, whichever party gets a majority, or if no one gets a majority, whoever can assemble a large enough coalition of parties, gets to form the government. But political power at this point wasn't just a straightforward product of how many seats in Parliament you had. The Queen could pick leaders from the minority faction if she wanted and try to peel off moderate members of the majority faction into supporting her agenda. Sometimes bribery was used, for instance offering someone a lordship for their support. Today, parties are much more disciplined. Members of a party very reliably vote the same way on a given issue. That was less true back then. Today, if you tried to run Parliament through the minority party, the majority could just block all of your actions, but back then a minority government could hope to get some support from members of other factions. Enough to pass important bills, at least. Still, as king or queen, the will of Parliament was a major constraint on your actions. You had to choose leaders who were reasonably acceptable to a majority of Parliament, even if they didn't come from the majority faction. Queen Anne didn't have any heirs. She had been pregnant 17 times, but a full 12 of those pregnancies had been stillborn or miscarried. 4 of her children died before they turned 2 years old, and her only child to survive beyond that was always sickly and died at age 11. This personal tragedy created a national problem. Without a direct heir, the line of succession reverted back to Catholics. To fix this problem, in 1701 Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement, which forever forbade Catholics from taking the throne. As a result, the line of succession jumped to some distant relatives, the House of Hanover, a German dynasty who are currently ruling a medium-sized territory in the Holy Roman Empire. Anne died in 1714 at the age of 49, soon after the War of the Spanish Succession formally ended. With her death, the Stuart dynasty lost the British throne, and power peacefully passed to George I, first of the Hanoverians. Next episode, we'll return to New England to see how well they're doing now that the Dominion has been overthrown. Spoiler alert, this is the time of the Salem witch trials, so not great. But still, join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America. If you like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. You can also keep track of Early and Often on Twitter at EarlyOftenPod, or read transcripts of every episode of the blog at earlyandoftenpodcast.wordpress.com. Thanks for listening.